So in this lecture, we're going to be going more in depth in the 5 different concepts that we talked about in the previous lecture. Reason, the cue, the routine, the reward, and the craving. And as we said, the reason is usually something that caused this behavior to begin. Whether it's your friend giving you a cigarette and inviting you for a smoke, whether it's you imitating your peers or your siblings and going to the gym, this is the reason why this behavior started, and then afterwards comes the habit loop, which made out of this behavior an automatic behavior. So you need to know what is the real reason why this habit started. And the reason why has nothing to do with you changing the actual habit, but it's just you becoming aware of reasons that might generate future habits. Next time there's a certain reason that is generating a behavior that might transform into a habit, the fact that you know that there is a reason behind each and every behavior that would eventually become a habit, this will make you aware. You will become mentally aware of the reason, and you will most probably be able to detect a certain behavior before it being transformed into an actual automatic and unconscious behavior. Now, after the reason comes the cue. As soon as the habit loop is established, we are right now talking about the first step of it, which is the cue. And the cue starts as soon as you feel the urge to start your habit. This is exactly where the cue is. It might be at a certain time or at a certain place. You might be with somebody else. You might be doing a certain thing, or you might be feeling something. These can all be linked to different cues that can be part of the routine or the habit that you have, of the habit loop in general. And of course, the cue is repetitive. So every single time this cue happens, there is the behavior or the habit that unfolds afterwards. But the cue is fixed and it's repetitive. Every single time, the habit has a single or several cues that are repeating every single time for the mind to be able to process this as a cue when it's forming the habit loop inside your brain. So, in short, the cue is the one thing that is starting the urge or starting the habit. It's the thin line that separates the inaction from the action. And as we said, it's not always just one cue. Sometimes there are several cues in the game that are building this urge or starting this habit. You might be aware of some of them, and there might be a lot of other cues that you're not aware of. And eventually, in further lectures, in the analysis that you're going to do to eliminate old or bad habits or create new habits, you're going to understand how to identify cues, what kind of questions you need to ask yourself to figure out exactly what the cue is or what the cues are. And it's very important to realize what your cue is and to analyze your cue properly, because this is where the habit is starting. And if you know how the habit is starting, you will have much more control on it further when you want to talk about the routine, when you talk about the reward, when you want to work on them. Once you have a solid foundation and analysis of the cue, it'll be easier for you to juggle up with the routine and with the reward, and eventually, of course, with the craving itself. Now, the routine is the habit itself. What does the cue lead to? So as soon as the cue is there, the first action that unfolds after the cue is usually the action that starts the routine. And it might be different. You need to see how it builds up, how this routine is building up. You might have the same habit that kind of unfolds differently and builds up differently depending on the cue that is present. So if you had this habit of smoking a lot whenever you're bored, let's say this is one cue, getting bored, the routine that unfolds afterwards is you smoking, let's say, a cigarette. However, when you're bored and you're with friends, there are 2 cues here, but then you smoke even more. So you are doing the routine, which is you smoking, but you're smoking even more. So it's building up more because there are 2 cues linked to the same routine and not just one. And afterwards, you need to know the different steps in the routine. Some people build the routines based on different steps that they follow each and every time. And becoming aware of each and every step would be even better, because when you're trying to change the routine, you'll have more flexibility. You'll be able to change steps separately without having to change the entire routine as a whole, because sometimes the habit or the routine is just too big or too complex for it to be changed automatically and all by itself. So cutting it down into steps would make it much easier to change this routine eventually. And of course, when we say routine, we're saying habit. So the cue and the reward are the two extremes of it, but what's in the middle, which is the routine, is the habit itself. And eventually, that's what you want to change. Now, rewards and cravings can be the same sometimes, and sometimes they can be really different. It can happen that you have a reward that is not actually a craving. When we talk about a craving, we're talking about physical and psychological dependency, which means that when you're craving something and you try to avoid it, your mind will release a stress hormone and make you feel discomfort until you satisfy the craving. And once you do, your reward system will be boosted. However, when we're talking about a reward that is not a craving, your stress system and your reward system are not involved. And therefore, it's of course easier to deal with a reward that is not an actual craving than a reward that is itself a craving. Drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes usually create a craving and therefore a physical or psychological dependency inside the brain. These cravings tend to usually be physical cravings, but in other instances we have a lot of also psychological cravings. When somebody wants to eat a pizza and they feel like they're craving the pizza in a way that eating this pizza would give them relief, and then after they finish it they feel so full, they don't feel relief at all, but the craving is gone, of course. And the reason why is because of the stress hormones that were making you feel discomfort, and they make you feel as if the craving is the only way to beat or overcome this discomfort. And once you do succumb to your cravings, then you will boost your reward system, and eventually you'll be getting into the cycle of building the habit. Now, when the reward is itself a craving, there needs to be a bit of a different approach when you're trying to find a solution for this habit, whether you're trying to change it or eliminate it, because it's harder when it's a craving, because then it's something that you need, not just something that you want. Rewards usually is something that you want. Do you want to get this reward out of the habit? But a craving is something that you need, and it's much more difficult to overcome something that you need than overcoming something that you just want. And of course, also knowing the difference between the reason and the cue is essential, because at a lot of instances, people mix up between the reason and the cue. And at one point, when they're trying to work on their habit, they start working on the reason, when in fact the cue is different, and they find themselves helpless and not being able to actually change the habit or eliminate it. And of course, eventually, our end goal is to change the routine itself. Once you're aware of the cue and the reason, and once you're aware of the reward and the craving, and you know how to work on them, then it can be as easy as just changing the routine, taking this routine that you have out and putting another routine, establishing a new routine in your daily life.